People say funerals are quiet, that grief keeps everyone polite, that nothing truly ugly happens when someone is being laid to rest. That's a lie, because the day my grandfather was buried, one woman shattered the silence so violently that every head turned, every breath stopped, and every secret began to crawl out into the open. "Where's the will?" Her voice cut through the wind like a blade. We were standing on a small hill at the edge of a rural town, the kind of place where the land stretches farther than the eye can see and everyone knows everyone else's business. Black suits, folded hands, a wooden casket lowered slowly into the earth. I remember staring at the dirt, still fresh, still damp, trying to accept that the man who raised me was really gone. Then she stepped forward. She wasn't family. She didn't belong there. Yet she stood at the front like she owned the place, heels sinking into the grass, eyes sharp and demanding. People would later call her HOA Karen. But in that moment, she was just a woman with too much confidence and not enough shame. She looked straight at me, not with sympathy, not with respect, but with suspicion. Like I was hiding something. I didn't answer. Couldn't. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. Because the truth was, I didn't know how to explain what my grandfather had really left behind, or what it meant. Behind us, the land rolled on for miles. 900 acres of fields, woods, and forgotten fences. Property most people didn't even realize existed anymore. Land my grandfather had protected fiercely, quietly, for decades. To outsiders, he was just an old man living simply. To the town, he was harmless. But to certain people, he was an obstacle. And now he was gone. The woman took another step closer, lowering her voice but not her hostility. She talked about documents, about rules, about ownership, about how things should be done. She spoke with the authority of someone used to getting her way, someone who believed power came from paperwork and pressure. The kind of person who runs an HOA and thinks that gives them control over lives they don't understand. I felt eyes on me from every direction. Curious, judgmental, expectant. Everyone wanted to know the same thing she did. Had my grandfather really left everything to me? Was there a will? And if there was, why hadn't it been read yet? What no one knew was that my grandfather and I had spent countless evenings sitting on his porch, watching the sun sink into those acres of land. He used to tell me stories about boundaries, about people who tried to take what wasn't theirs, about promises made quietly instead of written loudly. He warned me that one day, people would come asking questions they didn't really want the answers to. I just never imagined it would start at his funeral. The wind picked up, rustling the trees like whispers passing judgment. The pastor paused, unsure whether to continue. The woman crossed her arms, confident, almost smug, as if she already knew how this would end. In her world, people like me didn't inherit power. They lost it. I finally looked up and met her eyes. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Doubt, or maybe fear, because buried beneath that quiet countryside, beneath those 900 acres, beneath my grandfather's silence, was a truth that would change everything. A truth that would decide who really owned the land, and who was about to lose far more than they ever expected. And as the first shovelful of dirt hit the casket, I realized this wasn't the end of my grandfather's story. It was the beginning of a fight no one saw coming. After the funeral ended, people lingered longer than they needed to. Conversations stayed hushed, but eyes followed me wherever I moved. Grief had already made the day heavy, but now something else hung in the air. Curiosity mixed with calculation. Everyone was wondering the same thing. What exactly had my grandfather left behind, and who would control it now? My grandfather wasn't a wealthy man in the way people usually measure wealth. He didn't drive a new truck. His house was old, paint peeling, porch boards worn smooth by time. But he owned land. A lot of it. 900 acres that had been in his care long before zoning boards, HOAs, or development signs started creeping into the countryside. That land was the reason people smiled politely at him in public and whispered about him in private. When I was a kid, he used to take me riding along the fence lines. He'd point out where property markers had mysteriously moved over the years. He told me stories about neighbors who tried to claim, just a little strip of land. About officials who showed up with papers full of fine print. He always handled it quietly, calmly, like a man who knew something others didn't. Land teaches patience, he used to say, and it teaches people's true intentions. The HOA woman had been one of those intentions. She'd arrived in town a few years back when new developments started popping up near the edge of my grandfather's property. Perfect lawns, strict rules, a board full of people who loved authority more than responsibility. She rose fast. Loud meetings, threatening letters, complaints about fences, roads, and access points that had existed longer than the HOA itself. My grandfather never raised his voice at her. He never argued. He just listened, smiled, and kept telling me, "Let people show you who they are." After his death, that smile haunted me. In the days following the funeral, the pressure started. Calls from people I barely knew. Town officials suddenly interested in clarifying property lines. Neighbors asking casual questions that didn't feel casual at all. And then there were the HOA notices, formal, aggressive, citing regulations that didn't seem to apply but were sent anyway. Each one carried the same unspoken message. We're watching, and we're waiting. The woman herself showed up once, standing at the edge of the property like she was inspecting merchandise. Her confidence hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. She talked about development plans, about community standards, about how unused land could be better managed. She never mentioned my grandfather by name. Just the land. Always the land. What made it worse was my own uncertainty. I knew my grandfather had planned ahead. He always did. But he'd been private to a fault. He believed that not everything valuable needed to be announced. I had fragments, conversations, hints, warnings, but no clear map. No neat explanation I could hand over to make everyone back off. At night, I'd sit alone in his house, surrounded by the smell of old wood and dust, listening to the wind move through acres of darkness. I replayed our conversations, trying to remember what I'd missed. Somewhere in all of that silence, there was a truth powerful enough to threaten people who thought they were untouchable. The HOA woman sensed that too. Her tone changed. Less shouting, more smiles, the kind that don't reach the eyes. She spoke about cooperation now, about avoiding unnecessary conflict. But her impatience showed in small ways. A clenched jaw, a tapping foot, a glance toward the fields like time itself was working against her. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted proof. And the longer those answers didn't come, the more dangerous the situation became. Because whatever my grandfather had done, whatever he'd set in motion, it wasn't meant to be rushed. And I was starting to realize that the question she screamed at the funeral wasn't the real threat. The real danger was what would happen when the truth finally surfaced, and who would be standing on the wrong side of it. The longer things stayed unresolved, the more people began choosing sides, even if they didn't admit it out loud. Small towns have a way of doing that. Silence isn't neutral. It's strategic. Some neighbors stopped waving when they drove past. Others suddenly became friendlier than they'd ever been, offering help I hadn't asked for, asking questions they pretended were harmless. Every interaction felt like a test. One subplot unfolded quietly through the town clerk's office. Records that should have been easy to access suddenly required appointments. Files took longer to retrieve. A man I barely knew warned me, in a low voice, that there were rumors about pending rezoning discussions tied to my grandfather's land. He wouldn't say who started them. He didn't need to. Power leaves fingerprints. Another pressure point came from my own doubts. I wasn't a land baron or a legal expert. I was someone who'd grown up believing hard work and honesty were enough. Now I had to decide how much of myself I was willing to harden. Part of me wanted to cooperate, to smooth things over, to avoid conflict. Another part remembered my grandfather's calm certainty. He never bent just to make others comfortable. Was I strong enough to do the same? The HOA woman watched all of this closely. She stopped showing up unannounced and started sending representatives instead. Lawyers, consultants, people who spoke in polite threats and careful smiles. They framed everything as concern for the community, for growth, for fairness. But fairness, I was learning, often meant taking from whoever stood alone. One evening, I found an old notebook tucked behind a row of dusty books in my grandfather's study. It wasn't labeled. Inside were dates, initials, rough sketches of property lines, and cryptic notes that made little sense on their own. Names appeared more than once, some familiar, some not. One name stood out. The HOA woman's maiden name. My stomach tightened. This wasn't coincidence. It was history. At the same time, another storyline was unfolding beyond my control. A local developer began attending town meetings again, sitting quietly in the back. He didn't speak much, but he listened. People whispered about partnerships, about deals waiting for the right moment. The land wasn't just land anymore. It was leverage. Emotionally, the weight started to show. I snapped at people who didn't deserve it. I slept poorly. Every decision felt irreversible. Trust became a luxury I couldn't afford. Even the woman from the funeral, the one whose quiet presence had once felt grounding, kept her distance now. When we did talk, there was hesitation in her voice, like she was afraid of being pulled into something dangerous just by standing too close. And maybe she was right, because the more I dug, the clearer it became that my grandfather hadn't just been protecting property. He'd been holding a line, against shortcuts, against manipulation, against people who believed rules only applied when they benefited from them. Whatever he'd done, it had clearly frustrated powerful interests for years. Foreshadowing came in subtle ways. A survey marker that vanished overnight. A letter mailed to the wrong address but clearly meant for me. A casual comment from an old neighbor about how things almost changed once, a long time ago. Everyone seemed to know pieces of the story, but no one knew the whole truth. And neither did I. That uncertainty was the most dangerous part, because the HOA woman wasn't afraid of what she knew. She was afraid of what she didn't. Her impatience was growing. Her allies were lining up, and somewhere between old notebooks, shifting alliances, and my own fear of becoming someone I didn't recognize, the stakes kept rising. Whatever my grandfather left behind wasn't just an inheritance. It was a challenge, and I was starting to understand that if I made the wrong move, even with good intentions, I could lose far more than land. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It tightened, slowly, deliberately, like someone turning a dial and watching to see when I'd crack. A certified letter appeared in my mailbox. Then another. The HOA was requesting an urgent review of boundary compliance. Town officials scheduled a special meeting with my name on the agenda. A survey crew showed up one morning without notice, orange vests bright against the green fields, acting like they belonged there. When I asked who sent them, no one gave a straight answer. I told them to leave. They didn't argue. That scared me more than if they had. Word spread fast. Phones rang. Messages stacked up. People stopped pretending this was about paperwork. This was about control. About who would decide the future of those 900 acres. About whether my grandfather's quiet resistance had finally run out of time. I went back to the notebook, again and again, reading the same lines, hoping they'd rearrange themselves into something clearer. The sketches weren't random. They overlapped. Old boundaries layered over new ones. There were dates that matched key zoning changes. And certain initials kept repeating, always near disputes, always near decisions that never quite went the HOA's way. The woman's name appeared again and again. When I saw her at the town hall meeting, she looked different, composed, polished, but there was tension in her posture, a stiffness she couldn't hide. She spoke calmly about cooperation, about respecting the law, about honoring community standards. Her words were smooth, rehearsed, but her eyes kept flicking toward me, like she was measuring how much I knew. I said nothing. That silence was louder than any argument. The room felt divided. Some faces avoided mine. Others watched with open anticipation. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a countdown. Everyone sensed it. Something was about to surface, and once it did, there would be no walking it back. Outside, the sky darkened earlier than expected. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, the kind of weather that presses down on your chest. I stepped out for air, and that's when she followed. "Your grandfather was a complicated man," she said, standing beside me but not looking over. Her voice was steady, almost kind. Almost. He made things harder than they needed to be. I turned toward her. Or he made them honest. For the first time, she smiled without warmth. Honesty depends on who's telling the story. That's when I realized she was afraid. Not of losing an argument. Of losing leverage. Because whatever the truth was, it didn't favor speed. Or pressure. Or public bullying. It favored patience. Records. History. The kind of things my grandfather had mastered. Back at the house that night, I found something new. A folder hidden behind a loose panel in the study wall. Inside were copies of old correspondence. Legal-looking. Formal. Addressed to people who still held influence in town. Some letters were never sent. Others were returned unopened. But one detail stood out immediately. Dates. They lined up perfectly with the moments the HOA had tried and failed to expand control. My hands shook. Not with excitement. With understanding. This was bigger than I thought. A knock sounded at the door. Sharp. Insistent. I froze. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. The wind howled across the fields. Whoever was standing on the porch didn't knock again. They waited. And in that moment, with secrets inches from exposure and powerful people closing in, I knew the next step I took would decide everything. I reached for the door handle. And stopped. I didn't open the door. Not right away. I stood there, hand hovering inches from the handle, listening to my own heartbeat pound louder than the wind outside. Whoever it was knew I was home. The lights were on. My truck was out front. Waiting wasn't patience, it was pressure. When I finally opened it, the last person I expected was standing there. It wasn't the HOA woman. It wasn't a lawyer. It was the town clerk. She looked nervous. Not rushed. Not angry. Nervous in a way that suggested she'd already made a decision she couldn't undo. She asked if she could come in. I hesitated, then stepped aside. The moment the door closed behind her, she spoke fast, like she was afraid courage would abandon her if she slowed down. "They're moving sooner than planned," she said. "Rezoning. Emergency filings. They're calling it a correction, not a change. If it goes through, your land won't technically be yours to control anymore." I felt the room tilt. "Who's they?" She didn't answer immediately. She pulled a folded document from her bag and placed it on the table between us. I recognized the format. Internal notices. Not public. Not supposed to leave the building. Then she said it. The HOA board. And someone else. A developer. The same one sitting quietly in the back of meetings. The twist wasn't that they were working together. It was how long they had been. She explained that this wasn't a reaction to my grandfather's death. It was a contingency plan. Years in the making. Waiting for the one moment he could no longer object. They assumed I'd panic. Sell. Or fail to respond in time. "They didn't expect you to stay silent," she admitted. That scared them. Before I could ask more, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, face draining of color. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered. "If they find out." Another knock at the door. Louder this time. She looked at me like she'd already betrayed someone and was about to betray someone else depending on what I did next. "Go out the back," I said. She hesitated, then nodded, vanished into the hallway. I opened the front door to find two men in suits and, behind them, the HOA woman. Calm, smiling, victorious. "We're concerned," she said, stepping forward without waiting for permission. "You've been given some misleading information." I held the door open. Funny. I was thinking the same thing. Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the house, searching. In that moment, I understood the real game. This wasn't about rules or paperwork. It was about timing, about forcing me into a mistake before I fully understood what my grandfather had set up. Because while they were pushing forward, someone else was pulling back. Cross-cutting choices collided everywhere at once. The clerk choosing to risk her job. The developer choosing speed over subtlety. The HOA woman choosing intimidation over patience. And me? I finally chose to open the folder all the way. Later that night, alone again, I spread the documents across the table. Letters, maps, agreements that never made it to public record, but were legally binding all the same. My grandfather hadn't just anticipated this fight. He'd prepared for betrayal. One document stood out. A clause triggered only under specific conditions. Conditions that were now being met almost perfectly. It didn't transfer ownership. It froze it. Locked development. Forced independent review. And named a beneficiary no one expected. Not me. The romantic, quiet woman from the funeral. The one person everyone overlooked. My chest tightened as realization hit. My grandfather hadn't trusted power to stay with one person. Not even family. He trusted balance. And somewhere across town, unaware that her life was about to change, she was about to be pulled into a storm she never asked for. Meanwhile, the HOA woman was accelerating her moves, convinced she was winning. She had no idea the direction of the story had just shifted. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just cost her land. It would cost her everything she thought she controlled. The confrontation didn't happen on the land. It didn't happen at my house either. It happened where my grandfather always said the truth eventually surfaced. Under bright lights, with witnesses, and nowhere left to hide. The emergency town meeting was packed. Standing room only. The developer sat stiffly near the front. The HOA woman was confident again. Dressed sharply, papers neatly stacked like armor. She smiled at people she thought were allies. She didn't look at me. The clerk was there too. Pale. Determined. When the meeting was called to order, the agenda moved fast. Rezoning. Boundary clarification. A vote ready to be rushed through under the excuse of administrative correction. Exactly as she'd warned me. Then I stood. I didn't speak loudly. I didn't need to. I requested the independent review clause be acknowledged and enforced. The room murmured. The HOA woman finally turned, irritation flashing across her face. "That clause doesn't apply," she said quickly. Too quickly. The clerk cleared her throat. Her hands shook as she confirmed it did. The documents had been filed years ago. Quietly. Legally. Triggered by coordinated rezoning attempts after the original landholder's death. My grandfather's death. The developer leaned forward. Confusion crept in. The HOA woman stood up. "This is absurd. That land was never yours," the clerk finished. Then came the moment no one expected. The beneficiary named under the clause was called forward. She stood slowly. The woman from the funeral. The one whose silence everyone had mistaken for weakness. Her eyes met mine, wide with shock. She hadn't known. Not until that morning, when she'd been served paperwork explaining her temporary authority as trustee over the land pending review. Gasps filled the room. The HOA woman laughed once. Sharp. Disbelieving. "She has no standing." That's when the final truth surfaced. My grandfather hadn't chosen her at random. Years earlier, when the HOA first tried to pressure him, she had testified quietly against them in a zoning dispute. She'd refused to lie. It had cost her friendships, opportunities, peace. He never forgot. Integrity mattered to him more than blood. The vote was halted. The rezoning frozen. The developer stood and left without a word. Deals evaporate quickly when daylight hits them. The HOA woman didn't shout this time. She didn't argue. She just sat down slowly, realizing every shortcut she'd taken had led her here. Investigations followed. Emails surfaced. Conflicts of interest exposed. Her authority collapsed piece by piece, not with drama, but with paperwork. The same weapon she'd always used on others. Weeks later, the land remained untouched. Protected. The review confirmed what my grandfather had known all along. The HOA had no claim. Never did. The unexpected twist came quietly, the way my grandfather did everything. He'd left me something too. Not land. A letter. In it, he wrote that inheritance wasn't about ownership. It was about responsibility. He trusted me to protect the truth, not possess it. To stand firm without becoming cruel. To let power pass through my hands, not stay there. The woman became a steward. The land stayed whole. The HOA dissolved under scrutiny. And me? I finally understood. The real fight was never about 900 acres. It was about who you become when everyone is watching, and when no one is. My grandfather didn't leave me land. He left me a legacy, and he made sure it couldn't be taken. Life didn't snap back to normal after the meeting. Stories like this never end with a clean cut. They soften, they settle, like dust after a storm. The land stayed quiet. No machines, no survey flags, just wind moving through tall grass the same way it always had. The independent review took months, but its conclusion never wavered. The boundaries held. The paperwork confirmed what my grandfather had protected for decades. Those 900 acres weren't a bargaining chip or a loophole. They were whole, intact, untouchable. The woman who had been named steward grew into the role slowly. First, she doubted herself. She told me she never wanted power, only fairness. That was exactly why my grandfather had chosen her. She approached every decision carefully, listening more than speaking, asking questions instead of making demands. The town noticed the difference. So did I. The HOA didn't survive the scrutiny. Once investigations began, the confidence that had once filled those meetings vanished. Resignations followed. Then silence. People who had hidden behind rules were suddenly exposed by them. The developer pulled out quietly, chasing easier ground elsewhere. Power, it turns out, doesn't like resistance when it's calm and patient. As for the town clerk, she kept her job. Barely. But she gained something else, respect. People started trusting her again. She had chosen truth over comfort, and in a town built on memory, that mattered. And me? I stayed. Could have left. Sold what little I'd been offered. Started over somewhere anonymous. But walking those acres at sunrise, I felt my grandfather everywhere. In the fence lines, in the creak of old boards, in the stillness that only exists when something has been defended long enough to breathe freely again. The letter he left me sits in a drawer now. I don't read it often. I don't need to. Its lessons settled into me the way land settles after a long winter. Power isn't loud. It doesn't shout at funerals or wave documents like weapons. Real power waits. It remembers. It chooses carefully. The HOA woman moved away not long after. No dramatic goodbye. No apology. Just absence. Some people don't learn lessons, they become examples. The woman from the funeral and I still talk. Sometimes about the land. Sometimes about nothing at all. There's a quiet understanding between us. A shared responsibility. A shared respect for what almost was lost. And when people ask me now what it felt like to inherit 900 acres, I tell them the truth. I didn't inherit land. I inherited a choice to protect instead of exploit, to stand firm without becoming hard, to remember that legacies aren't measured in acres, but in actions. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's this. When someone demands proof of your worth, your future, or your place in the world, don't rush to answer. Let time, truth, and patience speak for you, because the loudest voices often know the least. And sometimes the quiet ones are holding everything together. If the story made you think, made you feel, or reminded you of someone who stood their ground when it mattered, take a moment. Share it. Leave a comment. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? As my grandfather once wrote at the bottom of his letter, in careful, steady handwriting, guard what you love. The rest will reveal itself.